Hello students, welcome to Module 4.3.9, Models of Speciation. I described to you in a little diagram with the Charters River and several populations of, I think I call them lizards, showing you how speciation could work. And in fact, that was an example of our first model, which is the allopatric model of speciation. Before I describe the model, let's look at the etymology of the word allopatric. Allo means different, and patra refers to father, and this is a reference to fatherland. So different fatherlands are, in other words, non-overlapping ranges. In other words, the ranges of the two populations are isolated. And so the allopatric model suggests that populations that are physically isolated from one another are more likely to evolve differences leading to new species. This is most common. You recall in the 1-2 steps that I gave you that this stops gene flow and allows genetic differences to accumulate, allowing the two populations to genetically diverge. The second model is the sympatric model. And this suggests that species do not have to be geographically isolated for speciation to occur, that they can occur when their ranges overlap. And there's good evidence that this occurs quite frequently in plants, and even some animal species it is possible. The thing to remember is that in both models, you develop reproductive isolating mechanisms, either prezygotic or postzygotic, and that these reproductive isolating mechanisms reduce formation of less fit hybrids. They prevent hybrid matings or prevent hybrid offspring from being produced. Now, of the two, I suggest that you be able to describe and explain the allopatric model. The sympatric model you should know the basic definition of. Here is an illustration which describes the allopatric model of speciation. Here I say, give you some good advice, know this one well. So the colors actually represent different populations. Initially, we have a single species. It's divided into two populations by a barrier which prevents gene flow. Over time, we can see that genetic differences accumulate. This is due to mutations which occur in the separated populations but are not shared because of no gene flow. And eventually, they achieve differences sufficient to develop RIMs, or reproductive isolating mechanisms. And then if the two populations, and actually they're no longer just populations, they have now become two different species. So when they encounter one another, they're incapable of reproduction. And remember, our definition of the biological species concept is how we're describing a species or defining a species. And so with RIMs in place, or a RIM in place, we have two different species here at the end. And so that's kind of how allopatric speciation works. A good example of this might be pupfish. Pupfish are little fish that live in the arid West. 10,000 years ago, the West wasn't nearly as arid. This black actually shows inland lakes, and so the pupfish were more broadly distributed, and as the bodies of water shrank down, became more isolated, then the pupfish were isolated. This led to some speciation events. Here is Devil's Hole, Nevada. It's just over the border from California in the Mojave Desert. And it's the only place in the world that we can find this little fish, the Devil's Hole pupfish. And this is a monitoring system to monitor the water level, because that's what endangers this species. So the water level goes down and this body of water dries up, then the Devil's Hole pupfish will exist no more. And so this is an example of allopatric speciation. Right here in this little family tree that I know you can't read, I can't even hardly read it on the slide here. It shows different species, and a number of these species have already become extinct because of isolated bodies of water in the desert are very fragile and subject to degradation by human usage. I wanted to throw in a description of there's Devil's Hole, by the way, if you're wondering where it is. I wanted to throw in a description of sympatric speciation. where we could have one population in the same area, and they're not physically separated, but there might be two different habitat types, and you might have individuals that are better adapted to live in, say the two habitats are grassland and woodland, and one is better adapted to live in grassland and one is better adapted to live in woodland, that in fact they might start to choose different habitats, and you get non-random matings where the grassland types mate with grassland types and the woodland types mate with woodland types, and you might get two different types. That's one possible way. You can also get very rapid sympatric speciation with genetic events with a mutation. I showed you previously a white-flowered monkey flower, and that mutation could lead to it being pollinated by moths instead of by bees, which the pink and yellow flowers are pollinated by. And so you'd have different pollinators, you'd have almost instantaneous isolation, and so that could cause the development of a reproductive isolating mechanism. Anyway, don't worry too much about sympatric speciation, but know the definition that we're talking about speciation events that occur when the two populations are not physically isolated, that they can be in contact. And this actually shows that pretty well. This little illustration shows allopatric speciation, that there's a barrier and we get a new species, and this shows that the new species arises from within the boundaries of the old species. And an interesting example of this are the rift lakes in eastern Africa. This is a view from space of Lake Tanganyika, where there are many species of cichlids. Cichlids are really fascinating, and I'm sure you've noticed the aquarium in the lab, in the classroom, and they're I want to think, there's at least 3 species of cichlids in there. But here's the thing, in Lake Tanganyika, there was as many as 250 different species of cichlids. And many of them have become extinct because this huge honking fish here, which is called the Nile perch, has been introduced, and it's really screwed things up there. But it's amazing that you could have 250 species of in the same family of fish in the same lake. Even though it's a huge lake, it still is an amazing occurrence. And so with that, we will conclude our discussion of different models of speciation.